Lucy was delighted when Mr. Parnassus ended the session early at 6:15. He was told he could head to the kitchen to see if Miss Chapelwhite needed his help. He jumped up and spun in a little circle as he stomped his feet before heading toward the door, bellowing over his shoulder that he hoped Linus found their time together illuminating. Linus wasn't sure illuminating was the right word. They sat in silence as Lucy descended the stairs, making far too much noise for a boy his size. It sounded as if he bounced off every surface he could find on his way to the first floor. Linus knew Mr. Parnassus was waiting on him, and he took the opportunity to gather his thoughts as best he could. His notepad was distressingly blank. He'd forgotten to take down a single observation. That wasn't good for someone in his position, but he thought he was owed a little leeway with all he'd seen and heard since arriving on the island. "He's not what I expected," Linus finally said, staring off into nothing. "No?" He shook his head. "There's connotations behind the name Antichrist." He looked apologetically at Mr. Parnassus. "If I'm being honest." "Is there?" Mr. Parnassus asked dryly. "I hadn't noticed." "I'm not sorry for that. And I don't expect you to be." Mr. Parnassus looked down at his hands. "Can I tell you a secret?" That startled Linus. He'd gathered that the master of Marsyas didn't dispense his secrets often. It was infuriating but understandable. "Yes, of course." "I worried too when I heard he was being sent to the island." Linus stared at him. "You worried?" Mr. Parnassus arched an eyebrow. Linus found that he had to remind himself that according to his file, this man was 5 years older than he. He looked oddly young. Linus didn't know why, but he sat a little straighter, and if he sucked in his stomach slightly, it was no one's business but his own. "Why do you sound so offended?" "I worry when the bus is late. I worry when I sleep through my alarm. I worry when I go to the store on the weekends and avocados are so expensive. Those are worries, Mr. Parnassus." "Those are mundane," he corrected gently, "the trappings of a normal life. And there's nothing wrong with that. I say worried because it's the best way I know how to express my feelings. I worried because he was alone. But I feel that way with all these children. I worried how he would fit in with the others who were already here. I worried that I wouldn't be able to provide him what he needed." "And him being what he is?" Linus asked. "Did you worry about that too? It seems to me that should have been at the forefront of all your worries." He shrugged. "Of course, but it didn't outweigh anything else. I understand the severity of the situation, Mr. Baker, but I couldn't let that become the focus. That's all he's ever known, people worrying about what he is, what he's capable of, because their worry was only a thin cover for fear and revulsion. And children are far more observant than we give them credit for. If he saw the same thing in me as everyone else, what hope would there be?" "Hope?" Linus said stupidly. "Hope," Mr. Parnassus repeated, "because that is what we must give him, what we must give all of them. Hope and guidance and a place to call their own, a home where they can be who they are without fear of repercussion. Forgive me, but I think to equate Lucy to the others is a bit short-sighted. He's not like anyone else." "Neither is Talia," Mr. Parnassus snapped, "or Theodore, or Fee, or Sal, or Chauncey. They're here because they aren't like anyone else. But that doesn't mean that's the way it needs to stay." "You sound naive." "I'm frustrated," Mr. Parnassus said. "These children are faced with nothing but preconceived notions about who they are, and they grow up to be adults who know only the same. You said it yourself. Lucy wasn't who you expected him to be, which means you already had decided in your head what he was. How can we fight prejudice if we do nothing to change it, if we allow it to fester? What's the point?" "And yet you stay here on the island," Linus said defensively. "You don't leave. You don't let them leave." "I am protecting them from a world that doesn't understand. One day at a time, Mr. Baker. If I can instill confidence in them, a sense of self, then hopefully it will give them the tools they need to face the real world, especially since it will be just as hard for them. It doesn't help when Dicomey sends someone like you to interfere." "Someone like me?" Linus asked. "What's that supposed to—" Mr. Parnassus huffed out a breath. "I apologize. That was unfair. I know you're only doing your job." His smile was brittle. Regardless of your employer, I think you are capable of seeing beyond a file or a particular nomenclature. Linus wasn't sure if he'd been insulted or complimented. Have there been others before me? Caseworkers? Linus wasn't sure if he had. Oh, Mr. Parnassus nodded slowly. Once. I only had Talia and Fee then, although Zoe, Miss Chapelwhite, had already offered her assistance. There were rumors of the others, nothing concrete, but I made this house a home for them. For those I had, and in preparation in case more came. Your predecessor, he changed. He was lovely, and I thought he was going to stay, but then he changed. Linus heard all the things that were being said. He understood now why Miss Chapelwhite had laughed at him when he'd awkwardly asked if she and Mr. Parnassus were involved, and though it was surely none of his business, he asked, "What happened to him?" "He was promoted," Mr. Parnassus said quietly, "first to supervision, and then, last I heard, to extremely upper management, just like he always wanted. I learned a very harsh lesson then. Sometimes wishes should never be spoken aloud, as they won't come true." Linus blinked. Surely he couldn't mean, "Not the man with the jowls." Mr. Parnassus chuckled. "No." "Or the bespectacled man?" "No, Mr. Baker, not the bespectacled man. That left the handsome man with wavy hair, Mr. Werner, the one who had told Linus there were concerns about the capabilities of Arthur Parnassus." Linus was scandalized, though he couldn't quite be sure why. "But he is so... So, Mr. Parnassus asked. Linus latched onto the only thing he could think of. He serves dried out ham at the holiday party. It's terrible." Mr. Parnassus stared at him for a moment before he burst out laughing. Linus was startled by how warm and crackly the sound was, like waves crushing over smooth rocks. "Oh, my dear Mr. Baker, I truly do marvel at you." Linus felt oddly proud. "I try." "So you do," he said, wiping his eyes. They sat in silence again, and it was the most comfortable Linus had felt since arriving on the island. He didn't dare examine it much for fear it would show him things he wasn't ready to see, but he knew it was there. But like all things, it was temporary. His time here, much like his time in this world, was finite. It wouldn't do to think otherwise. Then, without even thinking, he said, "Can't? Arthur? Seriously, of all the things." Mr. Parnassus's eyes sparkled in the failing sunlight. He had his fallacies. "That's an understatement if I ever heard one." Schopenhauer said, "Schopenhauer, I take back everything nice I've ever said about you, Linus. You are banished from the island. Leave immediately." "He had some very pointed critiques, and he did so only to further validate Kant's work," Mr. Parnassus scoffed. "Validation isn't something Kant... My good man, that's where you are surely wrong." And on it went. Chapter 10. The ferry was waiting at the docks when Miss Chapelwhite stopped her car. Linus could see Merle moving about on deck. He waved at them irritably, a scowl on his face. "Quite the impatient fellow, isn't he?" Linus mused as the gate lowered from the ferry. "You don't know the half of it," Miss Chapelwhite muttered. "Man acts like he has business elsewhere. Mr. Parnassus is the only one who pays him for use of that rickety old boat, and he knows it. We don't even need to use it, but we do to keep the peace. How would you... You know what? I don't want to know. Shall we then?" She sighed. "If we must." "I fear we must," Linus said wisely. She glanced at him as she put the car in drive and pulled forward slowly. He thought she was going to say something, but she didn't speak. He wondered if he was projecting. The ferry listed slightly as the car boarded, and though Linus felt uneasy or queasy, it wasn't as it had been when he'd first arrived a week ago. That gave him pause. Had it really only been a week? He'd arrived on a Saturday, and yes, it had been exactly a week. He didn't know why that surprised him. He was homesick still, but it was a dull ache in the pit of his stomach. That probably wasn't a good sign. Miss Chapelwhite turned off the car as the gate rose again behind them. The horn blew from somewhere above them, and they were off. Linus stuck his hand out of the car, letting the sea breeze blow between his fingers. They had only been aboard a few minutes when Merle appeared. "You have my money?" he demanded. "And remember, the fee has doubled." Miss Chapelwhite snorted. "I do, you old codger." She leaned over to reach into the glove compartment. Linus panicked. "Who's piloting the ferry?" Merle frowned at him. "These things could mostly handle themselves. Computers, wouldn't you know?" "Oh," Linus said without thinking. "What's the point of you, then?" Merle glared. "What did you say?" "Your fee," Miss Chapelwhite said sweetly, thrusting an envelope into his hands. "And Mr. Parnassus asked that I relay a message to you. He hopes the fee doesn't double yet again in the foreseeable future." Merle's hand was shaking as he snatched the envelope from her hand. "I bet he does. Price of doing business, I'm afraid. It's a tough economy." "Is it? I hadn't noticed." Merle's smile was cruel. "Of course you hadn't. Your kind thinks it's better than all the rest of us." "You would do well to stand down," Linus advised, "and be careful not to drink that fee away. I'd hate to think how you'd survive this tough economy if you did." Merle glared at him before spinning on his heels and stomping back to the wheelhouse. "Bastard," Linus muttered. He glanced over at Miss Chapelwhite, only to find her staring at him. "What?" She shook her head. "You—" "It doesn't matter." "Out with it, Miss Chapelwhite." "Call me Zoe, would you? This Miss Chapelwhite business is getting old." "Zoe," Linus said slowly. "I suppose that's all right." "And you'll be Linus." "I don't know why it matters so much," he grumbled, but he didn't tell her no. She dropped him off in front of the post office, pointing a few blocks down to the storefront for the grocers. "Come down when you're finished. I'll try to make it quick. I want to get back to the island so we're not late." "For what?" he asked, one hand on the door handle, a large flat envelope in the other. She grinned at him. "It's the second Saturday of the month." "So?" "We go on adventures with the children. It's a tradition." Linus didn't like the sound of that. "What sort of adventures?" She looked him up and down. "I'll need to get a few things for you. What you're wearing simply won't do, and I assume that's all you brought. What's your waist size?" He balked. "I don't know that it's any of your business." She shoved him out of the car. "I have a good idea. Leave it to me. I'll see you at the grocer's." The tires screeched as she peeled off. People on the sidewalk stared at him as rubber smoke billowed. He coughed, waving his hand in front of his face. "How do you do?" he asked a couple walking arm in arm. They lifted their noses at him and hurried across the street. He looked down at himself. He wore slacks and a dress shirt and a tie, his usual attire. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what Miss Chapelwhite, Zoe, had in mind. No matter. He would tell her as much when he met her later. Much like the rest of the village, the interior of the post office was bright and sunny. It was painted in light pastels, lines of oversized shells along the walls. There was a bulletin board with a familiar flyer. "See something? Say something. Registration helps everyone." A man stood behind the counter watching him warily. His eyes were small, and he had thick, gnarled hair sticking out of his ears. His skin was weathered and tan. "Help you?" "I believe so," Linus said, stepping up to the counter. "I need to mail this off to the department in charge of magical youth." He handed over the envelope that held his first weekly report. It was extensive, probably more so than was necessary, but he hadn't made many revisions, so it's 27 handwritten pages. "Dicomie is it?" the man asked, staring down at the envelope with barely disguised interest that made Linus nervous. "Heard a representative was here. About damn time, too, if you ask me." "I didn't," Linus said stiffly. The man ignored him. He set the envelope on a scale before looking back at Linus. "I hope you're going to do the right thing." Linus frowned. "And what would that be?" "Close that place down. It's a menace." "How so?" He was proud how even his voice was. The man leaned forward as he dropped his voice. His breath smelled cloyingly of elderberry mints. "There's rumors, you know." Linus struggled not to recoil. "No, I don't. What rumors?" "Dark things," the man said. "Evil things. Those ain't children. They're monsters who do monstrous things. People go to that island and never return." "What people?" The man shrugged. "You know, people. They go out there and are never heard from again. That Parnassus, too? Queer fellow, if there ever was one. Lord knows what he's got them doing out there all by themselves. He paused. Then, I've even seen some of them. The children? He snorted. Yeah, if you can call them that. Linus cocked his head. Sounds like you watched them closely. Oh, yeah, the man said. They don't come here anymore, but when they did, you can bet I kept my eye on them. Interesting, Linus said. I'm sure I can amend my report to let Dicombe know that a man of your age took an unhealthy interest in orphan children. Would that do? Especially if they already pay you to keep quiet. Which doesn't seem something you're capable of. The man took a step back, eyes widening. That's not what I'm not here for your opinion, sir. I'm here to mail out that envelope. That's all that's required of you. The man's eyes narrowed. $3.25. I'll need a receipt, Linus said as he paid, to be reimbursed. Money doesn't grow on trees, after all. The man slammed the receipt on the counter. Linus signed it, took his copy, and had turned to leave when... You're Linus Baker? He glanced back. Yes. Have a message for you. If it's anything like the message you just relayed, I don't need it. The man shook his head. Foolish. It ain't from me, though. You would do well to listen so you aren't the next to disappear. It's all official from Dicombe. He wasn't expecting anything, at least so soon. He waited as the man dug around through a crate next to him before finding a small envelope and handing it over. It was from Dicombe, just as the man had said, official seal and all. He was about to tear into it when he felt the man's eyes on him again. A thought struck him. Say, you wouldn't know anything about raft building, would you? The man looked confused. Raft building, Mr. Baker? Linus smiled tightly. Forget I asked. He turned and left the post office. Once out on the street, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it. It read, Department in charge of Magical Youth. Memo from extremely upper management. Mr. Baker, we are looking forward to your reports. As a reminder, we expect you to leave nothing out. Nothing. Sincerely, Charles Werner, extremely upper management. Linus stared down at it for a long time. He found Zoe in the grocer's right where she said she'd be. She had a full cart in front of her and appeared to be arguing with the butcher over a large piece of meat. All right, he asked, coming to stand beside her. Fine, Zoe muttered, glaring at the butcher. Just dickering. No dickering, the butcher said in a thick accent that Linus couldn't place. No dickering. All price go up. Zoe's eyes narrowed. For everyone? Yes, the butcher insisted. For everyone. I don't believe you. I take meat back then. Zoe reached out and snatched it from the countertop. No, it's fine. But I'll remember this, Marcel. Don't you think I won't? He flinched but didn't say another word. She dropped the meat in the cart and began to push it away. Linus followed. What's all that about? She gave him a tight smile. Nothing I can't handle. Get your report sent off? I did. And I don't suppose you'll tell me what was in it. He gaped at her. Of course not. That is a privileged communication meant for... She waved him off. Might as well try. And furthermore, as outlined in Rules and Regulations, page 519, paragraph 12, subparagraph, she sighed, I have no one to blame but myself. He thought about telling Zoe, odd that calling her by her name, first name, most unusual, what the man at the post office had said, but he didn't. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because he felt it wasn't anything she hadn't heard before. And besides, he told himself, the sun was shining. It was such a lovely day. There was no need to put a damper on it with the words of a bigot. There was a damper put on the day almost immediately after their return to the island. Really, he should have expected it. Merle hadn't said much beyond muttering how they took longer than expected, but they ignored him. As they were ferried back to the island, Linus watched a seagull following them overhead, and he remembered his mouse pad at Dicombe, the picture of the beach, asking if he wished he was here. He was. He was here. And that was dangerous thinking, because this was not a holiday, a trip well deserved after all his hard work. He was still working, and regardless of where he was, he couldn't forget that. He had already gone far beyond what he was used to. This Zoe and Arthur business certainly wasn't professional, but it would only be for 3 more weeks. His house waited for him, as did his sunflowers. Calliope certainly wanted to go home, no matter how often she could be found lying out in the sunlight in the garden for hours without moving. And so what if she'd meowed at him for the first time when he traced a finger between her ears, wondering if he was about to lose a hand? It meant nothing. Linus had a life which unfortunately seemed to be bent on stretching the boundaries of his sanity. He stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom of the guest house and stared at his reflection. Oh dear. Zoe had shoved a bag into his hand, telling him she'd gotten him an outfit for the adventure that afternoon. She had ignored his protests as she'd hoisted every single grocery bag out of the back of the car as if they weighed nothing. She'd left him standing in the driveway. He planned on leaving the bag unopened in the guest house. If he pretended it wasn't there, then he wouldn't need to look inside. To distract himself, he put away the clothes that had been cleaned and laid out on his bed. There was a note placed on top of them that read, "Your weekly washing service is complete. Thank you for staying at Marsyas Island. Your bellhop, Chauncey." The fact that Chauncey seemed to have washed all his clothes, including his underthings, definitely wouldn't do. Linus would have to speak to him about boundaries. No doubt he'd angle for a tip. It was while he was straightening out his ties that he realized only 3 minutes had passed, and he was still thinking about the bag. Just a peek, he muttered to himself. He peeked. What in the world? He asked no one in particular. Surely not. This is most inappropriate. Why, I never. Who does she think she is? Sprites. Useless, the lot of them. He closed the bag and tossed it back on the floor in the corner. He sat on the edge of the bed. Perhaps he could open his copy of Rules and Regulations to give himself a refresher. He obviously needed it. He was getting too familiar with the people here. A caseworker needed to retain a degree of separation. It allowed them to be objective and not to let their opinions be colored or swayed. It could be to the detriment of the children. He had to be a professional. He stood, meaning to do just that. Perhaps he could sit on the porch in the sun while he read. That sounded perfect. He was surprised when, instead of picking up the heavy tome, he lifted the bag from the floor again. He opened it, looking in. The contents hadn't changed. Probably wouldn't even fit, he muttered to himself. She can't just eyeball me and figure out my size. She shouldn't be eyeballing me anyway. It's rude. And with that, of course, he felt the need to prove her wrong. That way, when he saw Zoe again later, and certainly not after going on some kind of frivolous adventure, he could tell her that she should avoid a career as a personal shopper, seeing how bad she was at it. Yes, he would do just that. He put on the clothes. They fit perfectly. He sputtered as he stared at himself in the mirror. It looked as if he were outfitted for a safari in the wilds of the Serengeti or exploring the jungles of Brazil. He wore tan shorts and a matching tan collared shirt. The buttons toward the top of the shirt had been removed, almost as if they'd been torn off, so it was open at his throat, revealing smooth, pale skin. In fact, he was showing more skin than he could remember, and his legs were as white as a specter. To make matters worse, there were brown socks that rose halfway up his calves and sturdy boots that felt uncomfortable, as if they'd never been worn. But the most terrible thing of all was the helmet-style hat that completed the outfit. It felt strange on his head. So there he stood, staring at his reflection, wondering why, instead of looking like an explorer from the adventure stories he'd read as a child — his mother had hated them, so they had to be hidden under his bed and read late at night with a flashlight under his comforter — he looked more like a brown egg with limbs. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Absolutely not. I won't. I really won't. This is ridiculous. All of this is—" There was a pounding at the front door. He frowned as he looked away from the mirror. The pounding came again. He sighed. Just his luck. He went to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it. There, standing on the porch, were 5 children, all of whom were dressed in similar explorer outfits. Even Theodore wore a tan vest of sorts that had been tailored to leave room for his wings. He reared back and chirped at Linus loudly before spinning excitedly in a circle. "Whoa!" Talia breathed, looking him up and down. "You are round, like me." Thea bent over to inspect his kneecaps critically, wings fluttering behind her. "Why are you so pale? Do you not go outside? Ever? You're almost as clear as Chauncey is." Chauncey's eyes bounced on the end of his stocks. Hello! I hope you found your clothes properly laundered. If you notice an item missing, it's because I accidentally lost it, and I feel really sorry about it. Please still consider rating my service a 10. He held out a tentacle. Linus arched an eyebrow at him. Chauncey sighed as he pulled his tentacle back. "Aw, man." Lucy grinned up at Linus over a fake mustache far too large for his face. He too wore an explorer outfit, though his was red and he had an eye patch for reasons Linus didn't want to know. "Hello, Mr. Baker. I'm the leader of this expedition to find the treasure of the island sprite. I'm glad you decided to join us. Most likely, you'll die a horrible death at the hands and mouths of cannibals who will roast you alive on a spit and then lick the juices from your crackling skin. If you're lucky, the necrotizing fascists will go get to you first from a terrible bug bite, and your body will rot out from underneath you until you're nothing but a pile of bones and bloody pus. It's going to be wonderful." Linus gaped at him. "Children," another voice said, "do give Mr. Baker some room, won't you?" Linus looked up to see Arthur standing in front of the guest house, with Sal peering nervously from behind him. Sal was similarly dressed as the other children, and he appeared to be trying to hide his bulk behind Arthur when he saw Linus looking at him. He was unsuccessful, of course, given his size and that Arthur was as thin as a whisper. Linus felt his throat clog slightly at the sight of the dashing figure Arthur cut in his own ensemble. Instead of tan like the others, his pants and shirt were black, with a red sash across his chest. There was what appeared to be a machete in a scabbard at his waist. He had a mustache like Lucy's, though it looked far less ridiculous on him. It wiggled slightly as Arthur smiled at him. Linus flushed and looked away. He was suddenly very warm, a warm, round egg with pale limbs. He'd never cared much about his appearance before. He certainly didn't need to start now. This was a visit like any other he'd done in the past. Investigation, he reminded himself, not a visit. He opened his mouth to decline whatever invitation had been offered, and not because he actually believed there would be cannibals, though with Lucy he couldn't be sure. But before he could utter a single word, Lucy jumped from the porch and posed grandly, hands on his hips. "Let the adventure begin," he bellowed. He began to march toward the thick trees, knees kicking up high with every step he took. The other children followed. Theodore took flight, hovering above their heads. Sal glanced quickly at Linus and then ran after the others. "Coming, Linus?" Arthur asked. "Your mustache is ridiculous," Linus muttered as he stepped off the porch and stalked after the children. He pretended he didn't hear the quiet laughter behind him. "Okay," Lucy said, stopping at the edge of the trees. He turned back toward the group, eyes wide. "As you all know, there is an evil sprite." "Hey!" Fee cried. "Lucy, we don't call people evil," Arthur reminded him as Theodore settled on his shoulder. "It isn't polite." Lucy rolled his eyes. "Fine, I take it back. There is a murderous sprite." He paused as if waiting for any objections. There were none. Even Fee seemed gleeful. Linus felt the point had been missed entirely, but thought it wise to keep his mouth shut. "A murderous sprite who has a treasure hidden deep in the woods that is ours for the taking. I cannot promise your survival. In fact, most likely, even if you make it to the treasure, I will betray you and feed you to the alligators and laugh as they crunch on your bones." "Lucy," Arthur said again. Lucy sighed. "It's my turn to be in charge," he pouted. "You said I can do this the way I want." "I did," Arthur agreed, "but that doesn't mean betrayal." "But I'm secretly a villain." "Maybe we could all be villains," Chauncey warbled. "You don't know how to be bad," Talia told him. "You're too nice." "No, I can be bad. Watch." His eyes pivoted wildly until they landed on Linus. "Mr. Baker, I won't do your laundry next week. Ha, ha, ha." Then, in a panicky voice, he whispered, "I'm just kidding. I will. Please let me. Don't take that away." "I want to be a villain," Fee said, "especially since we're facing a murderous sprite. In case you didn't know, I'm also a sprite, and I should be murderous too." "I've always wanted to murder someone," Talia said, stroking her beard. "Do you think I have time to go back and get my shovel?" Theodore bared his teeth and hissed menacingly. "Sal," Lucy said morosely, "you want to be a villain too?" Sal peeked over Arthur's shoulder. He hesitated, then nodded. Fine, Lucy said, throwing up his hands. We'll all be bad. Fine. He grinned at them. And maybe I can still betray you all by being secretly good and... He grimaced, face twisting as he stuck out his tongue. No, that sounds terrible. Ugh. Ugh. Blech. Linus had a very bad feeling about this. Lucy led the way, shouting so loudly that birds squawked angrily as they took flight from their perches in trees. He asked Arthur if he could use his machete to hack through the thick vines that hung from the trees, something Linus found particularly alarming. He was relieved when Arthur declined, saying that children shouldn't handle such things until they were older. It didn't appear to be necessary, however. Whenever they seemed to be stuck, unable to move forward due to the growth of the forest, Fee would step forward. Her wings glistened brightly, shaking as she raised their hands. The vines slithered up the trees, raised her hands. The vines slithered up the trees as if alive, revealing the path ahead. The children exclaimed in delight as Fee looked on smugly. Linus got the idea that she'd made the path difficult to begin with, so she could be called upon. Even Sal was smiling as the vines whipped up into the trees. Linus learned rather quickly that even though he'd experienced more of the outdoors in the last week than he had in the past year, it did not mean he was in any kind of shape. Shortly, he was huffing and puffing, sweat dripping from his brow. He brought up the rear with Arthur, who seemed inclined to take a leisurely pace, something Linus was grateful for. "Where are we going?" Linus asked, after what he was sure had been hours, but in actuality had been less than one. Arthur shrugged, looking as if he wasn't winded in the slightest. "I haven't the foggiest. Isn't it delightful?" "I think you and I have very different definitions of delightful. Is there any kind of structure to this outing?" Arthur laughed. Linus was uncomfortable with how much he liked that sound. "Day in and day out, they have structure. Breakfast at 8 on the dot, then classes, lunch at noon, more classes, individual pursuits in the afternoon, dinner at 7:30, bed by 9. I believe that a break in routine every now and then does wonders for the soul. According to rules and regulations, children shouldn't have..." Arthur stepped easily over a large log, green moss growing up the side. He turned back and held out his hand. Linus hesitated before taking it. His movements were far less graceful, but Arthur kept him from falling on his face. Arthur dropped his hand at the children as the children shouted a little ways ahead. "You live by that book, I think." Linus bristled. "I do not. And even if I did, there's nothing wrong with that. It provides the order needed to create happy and healthy children." "Is that right?" Linus thought he was being mocked, but it didn't seem malicious. He doubted Arthur Parnassus had a cruel bone in his entire body. "It exists for a reason, Arthur. It's a governance that guides the world of magical youth. Experts from various fields all weighed in. Human experts." Linus stopped, hand against a tree as he caught his breath. "What?" Arthur wiped his face toward the canopy of the forest, turned his face toward the canopy of the forest. A shaft of sunlight had pierced the leaves and limbs and illuminated his face. He looked ethereal. "Human experts," he repeated. "Not a single magic person had any say in the creation of that tome. Every word came from the hand and mind of a human." Linus balked. "Well, that certainly can be true. Surely there was someone in the magical community who provided input." Arthur lowered his head to look at Linus. "In what position? No magical being has ever been in a position of power. Not at Dicombe, not in any role in the government. They aren't allowed. They're marginalized, no matter their age. But there are physicians who are magical. And lawyers. Yes, lawyers. Why, I know a very pleasant lawyer who is a banshee, very respectable." "And what sort of law does she practice?" "She works with magical beings attempting to fight their registration." "Ah," Arthur said, "I see. And the physicians?" Linus felt his stomach tighten. "They treat only magical beings." He shook his head, trying to clear his muddled thoughts. "There's a reason for all things, Arthur. Our predecessors knew the only way to help assimilate magical persons into our culture was to have stringent guidelines set in place to assure a smooth transition. Arthur's gaze hardened slightly. And who said they needed to be assimilated at all? Was any choice given? Well, no, I don't suppose it was, but it's for the greater good. For whom? What happens when they grow up, Linus? It's not as if things will change. They'll still be registered. They'll still be monitored. There will always be someone looking over their shoulder, watching every move they make. It doesn't end because they leave this place. It's always the same. Linus sighed. I'm not trying to argue with you on this. Arthur nodded. Of course not. Because if we were arguing, it would mean that we were both so set in our ways we weren't amenable to seeing it from another side. And I know I'm not that stubborn. Precisely, Linus said, relieved. Then, hey! But Arthur was already walking through the trees. Linus took a deep breath, wiped his brow, and followed. It goes back to Kant, Arthur said, as Linus caught up with him. Of course it does, Linus muttered. Bloody ridiculous, if you ask me. Arthur chuckled. Whether or not he was right is something else entirely, but it certainly brings about an interesting perspective on what is or isn't moral. That definition of immorality, the very definition of immorality is wickedness, Linus said. It is, Arthur agreed, but who are we to decide what's what? Millions of years of biological evolution. We don't stick our hand in fire because it could burn. We don't murder because it's wrong. Arthur laughed as if elated, and yet people still do both. Once in my youth, I knew a phoenix who loved the way the fire felt against his skin. People murder other people every day. You can't equate the two. You already did, Arthur said gently. My point remains in the same as it is in my sessions with Lucy. The world likes to see things in black and white, in moral and immoral, but there is gray in between, and just because a person is capable of wickedness doesn't mean they will act upon it. And then there is the notion of perceived immorality. I highly doubt Chauncey would even consider laying a tentacle on another person in violence, even if it meant protecting himself, and yet people see him and decide, based upon his appearance, that he is something monstrous. That's not fair, Linus admitted, even if he does hide under my bed one morning out of every 3. Only because he's still wrestling with what he was told he was supposed to be versus who he actually is. But he has this place, Linus said, ducking under a branch. Arthur nodded. He does, but he won't always. The island isn't permanent, Linus. Even if you, in your infinite wisdom, decide to allow us to remain as we are, one day he will go out into the world on his own, and the best thing I can do is to prepare him for that. But how can you prepare him if you never let him leave? Arthur whirled on Linus, a frown on his face. He's not a prisoner. Linus took a step back. That wasn't what I know that. I apologize if it came across any other way. I prepare them, Arthur said, but I do shelter them somewhat. For all that they are, for all that they can do, they're still fragile. They are lost, Linus, all of them. They have no one else but each other. And you, Linus said quietly. And me, Arthur agreed. And while I understand your point, I hope you can see mine. I know how the world works. I know the teeth that it has. It can bite you when you least expect it. Is it so bad to try and keep them from that as long as possible? Linus wasn't sure, and he said as much. But the longer they remain hidden, the harder it will be when the time comes. This place, this island, you said it yourself, it isn't forever. There's a whole wide world beyond the sea, and while it may not be a fair world, they have to know what else is out there. This can't be everything. I am aware, Arthur said, looking off into the trees with an inscrutable expression, but I like to pretend it is, sometimes. There are days it certainly feels like it could be. Linus didn't like the way he sounded. It was almost morose. For what it's worth, I never thought I'd be discussing moral philosophy while wearing tan shorts in the middle of the woods. Arthur burst out laughing. I find you fascinating. Linus felt warm again. He told himself it was the exertion. He swallowed thickly. You knew a phoenix, then? Arthur's gaze was knowing, but he didn't seem inclined to push. I did. He was inquisitive. Many things happened to him, but he still kept his head held high. I often think about the man he became. Arthur smiled tightly, and Linus knew the conversation was over. They continued through the woods.